Beatrix Potter, author, illustrator, farmer, natural scientist and land conservationist. Born in West Brompton, London, in the year 1866, Helen Beatrix Potter was educated by a governess, 3 different ones in fact, and sadly grew up isolated from other children, other than her younger brother Walter. Her father was a London barrister and practiced law, specialising in conveyancing and equity law, and her mother the daughter of wealthy cotton merchant and shipbuilder. Beatrix and her brother did not have many friends outside their large extended family. Her parents were artistic and interested in nature, more than likely the reason for Beatrix following in their footsteps for their love of the wilderness. She spent her childhood holidays in Scotland in the Lake District, surrounded by numerous animals, family pets, and the beautiful flora and fauna of the countryside, which she closely observed and painted. She became widely respected for her close study of fungi in the field of mycology, the fungi branch of biology, as she was able to capture every little detail in watercolour. As well as painting nature, Beatrix wrote picture letters to her 3rd governess's children, and it was Annie, her governess, who suggested that these letters would make a wonderful series of children's books. Beatrix took her inspiration from the numerous animals she cared for growing up, animals such as mice, rabbits, hedgehogs, guinea pigs, bats, and even a collection of butterflies and insects. She closely observed these small creatures and drew endlessly. She was devoted to caring for her animals and would even take them with her on long holidays. Beatrix's imagination and observation was nourished through summer holidays spent at Delguise, an estate on the River Tay in Scotland, and both she and her brother were allowed great freedom in the country, leading to the pair becoming very adept students of natural history. But it wasn't until the estate was no longer available and Beatrix and her family started to take their holidays in the Lake District at Ray Castle that Beatrix found her true inspiration for what would become her eternal legacy. Beatrix met Herdwick Walmsley, Vicar of Ray, and later founding secretary for the National Trust. His interest in country life and the countryside had a lasting impact on Beatrix throughout her life and inspired her. Beatrix kept a diary, which she started at around aged 14, and kept notes of society at the time, sketched her ideas, and it proves as a key aid in her creative development and artistic skills. Beatrix writes in tiny handwriting about her artistic and intellectual interests, her amusing insights on the places she visited, as well as recording her observations and descriptions of nature. This journal continues for 16 years and concludes in 1897, when Beatrix's artistic and intellectual talents were absorbed in scientific study and the efforts of publishing her drawings. Beatrix was determined to make something of herself and earn her own money. She yearned for independent activities, all whilst continuing to care for her parents and managing the family's various households. It was common in the Victorian era for parents to discourage women of Beatrix's class away from education. But this was not the case with the Potters. She was interested in every branch of natural science except astronomy. She collected fossils and studied artefacts found in London excavations. Beatrix recorded every specimen via sketching, and each sketch increased in skill. By 1890, Beatrix's interest rested mostly on mycology and fungi. Beatrix found fungi to be delightful to paint, and their colours and evanescence drew her in further. It was whilst on holiday in Scotland that Beatrix met Charles Mackintosh. He was a revered naturalist and amateur mycologist. He helped improve the accuracy of her illustrations, taught her taxonomy, and supplied her with live specimens to paint during the winter. Beatrix was curious as to how fungi reproduced and began microscopic drawings of fungus spores, and in 1895 developed a theory of their germination. Through the connections of her uncle, Sir Henry Enfield Roscoe, a chemist and Vice-Chancellor of the University of London, she consulted with botanists at Kew Gardens, convincing George Massey of her ability to germinate spores and her theory of hybridization. Turned away by the director at Kew because of her sex and her amateur status, Beatrix wrote up her conclusions and submitted a paper to the Linnean Society in 1897. It was introduced by Massey because, as a female, Beatrix could not attend proceedings or read her paper. She therefore withdrew it, realising that some of her samples were contaminated, but continued her microscopic studies for several more years. Her paper has only recently been rediscovered, along with the rich artistic illustrations and drawings that accompanied it. Her work is only now being properly evaluated. Beatrix later gave her other mycological and other scientific drawings to the Armit Museum and Library in Ambleside, where mycologists still refer to them to identify fungi. There is also a collection of her fungus paintings at the Perth Museum and Art Gallery in Perth, Scotland, donated by Charles Mackintosh. In 1967, the mycologist W.P.K. Findlay included many of Beatrix's beautifully accurate fungus drawings in his Wayside and Woodland Fungi, thereby fulfilling her desire to one day have her fungus drawings published in a book. And in 1997, the Linnean Society issued an apology to Beatrix for the sexism displayed in its handling of her research. Wanting to make some money, in the 1890s, Beatrix and her brother began to make and sell their own illustrated Christmas cards, and those for other occasions. Featuring mice and rabbits as the subjects of her fantasy paintings, Beatrix's talent soon caught the eye of the firm Hildesheimer and Faulkner. They purchased several drawings of her rabbit Benjamin Bunny to illustrate verses by Frederick Weatherly. Beatrix also sold some illustrations of a frog and some verses to the popular annual of the time, Changing Pictures, by Ernest Nister. This success pleased Beatrix dearly and encouraged her to publish her own illustrated stories. The turning point for Beatrix and her career was when she was on holiday in Scotland in 1893, and she had run out of things to say in her letters to her governess's children. Beatrix instead wrote a story about Flopsy, Mopsy, Cottontail and Peter, thus becoming the most famous children's letter ever written and the basis of Beatrix's career as an artist and storyteller. In 1900, Beatrix revisited the story of the Four Little Bunnies and turned it into a book, but unable to find a buyer for her work, Beatrix, at her own expense, published it only for her family and friends. Frederick Rawnsley, however, had great faith in Beatrix and her book, and enabled it to make its rounds of London, therefore ensuring that Frederick Rawn and Company reconsidered the Bunny Book, as they called it, as they wanted to compete with the booming children's book market. Beatrix was able to colour her pen and ink illustrations and chose the new Henschel 3-colour process to reproduce her watercolours. Following the success of the Flopsy Bunnies, in 1902 the Tale of Peter Rabbit was published, followed the following year by the Tale of Scribble Nutkin and the Tailor of Gloucester. Up until 1922, Beatrix released 2 or 3 books a year and in total had released 23 little stories. Beatrix continued with her creativity and artistic talents up until the war, where she then starts to solely focus on her farming, sheep breeding and land conservation. In 1905, against her parents' wishes, Beatrix became engaged to Norman Warne. Her parents did not agree with the match, as they felt it was not socially suitable due to Norman being in trade. But this engagement only lasted 1 month, as Norman died of pernicious anemia at the age of 37. The same year, Beatrix used some of her income and a small inheritance from an aunt to buy Hilltop Farm in the English Lake District near Windermere. The tenant farmer, John Cannon, and his family agreed to stay on to manage the farm for her whilst she made physical improvements and learned the techniques of fell farming and of raising livestock, including pigs, cows and chickens. The following year, she added sheep. Realising she needed to protect her boundaries, she sought advice from W.H. Heelis and Son, a local firm of solicitors with offices in nearby Hawkshead. With William Heelis acting for her, she bought contiguous pastures, and in 1909 the 20 acres Castle Farm across the road from Hilltop Farm. She visited Hilltop at every opportunity, and her books written during this period, such as The Tale of Ginger and Pickles, about the local shop in near Swarry, and The Tale of Mrs. Tittlemouse, a wood mouse, reflecting her increasing participation in village life and her delight in country living. Owning and managing these farms required routine collaboration with the widely respected William Heelis. By the summer of 1912, Heelis had proposed marriage and Beatrix had accepted, although she did not immediately tell her parents, who once again disapproved because Heelis was only a country solicitor. Beatrix and Heelis were married on the 15th of October 1913 in London at St Mary Abbots in Kensington. The couple moved immediately to near Swarry, residing at Castle Cottage, the renovated farmhouse on Castle Farm, which was 34 acres large. Hilltop remained a working farm, but was now remodelled to allow for the tenant family and Potter's private studio and workshop. At last her own woman, Beatrix settled into the partnerships that shaped the rest of her life. Her country solicitor husband and his large family, her farms, the Swarry community, and the predictable rounds of country life. The tale of Jemima Puddleduck and the tale of Tom Kitten are representative of Hilltop Farm and her farming life, and reflect her happiness with her country life. Beatrix continued to write stories for Frederick Warne and Company, and fully participated in country life. She established a nursing trust for local villages, and served on various committees and councils responsible for footpaths and other rural issues. Soon after acquiring Hilltop Farm, Beatrix became keenly interested in the breeding and raising of Herdwick sheep, the indigenous fell sheep. In 1923, she bought a large sheep farm in Troutbeck Valley called Troutbeck Park Farm, formerly a deer park, restoring its land with thousands of Herdwick sheep. This established her as one of the major Herdwick sheep farmers in this country. She was admired by her shepherds and farm managers for her willingness to experiment with the largest biological remedies for the common diseases of sheep, and for her employment of the best shepherds, sheep breeders and farm managers. By the late 1920s, Potter and a Hilltop Farm manager, Tom Story, had made a name for their prize-winning Herdwick flock, which took many prizes at the local agricultural show, where Potter was often asked to serve as a judge. In 1942, she became president-elect of the Herdwick Sheep Breeders Association, the first time a woman had been elected but died before taking office. Beatrix had been a disciple of the land conservation and preservation ideals of her longtime friend and mentor, Canon Hardwick Rawnsley, the first secretary and founding member of the National Trust for Places of Historic Interest or Natural Beauty. She supported the efforts of the National Trust to preserve not only the places of extraordinary beauty, but also those heads of valley and low grazing lands that would be irreparably ruined by development. Beatrix was also an authority on the traditional Lakeland crafts, period furniture and stonework. She restored and preserved the farms that she bought or managed, making sure each farmhouse had in its piece of antique Lakeland furniture. Potter was interested in preserving not only the Herdwick sheep, but also the way of life of fell farming. In 1930, the Heelises became partners with the National Trust in buying and managing the fell farms, including the large Monk Coniston estate. The estate was composed of many farms spread over a wide area of north-western Lancashire, including Tamhose. Potter was the de facto estate manager for the trust for 7 years, until the National Trust could afford to repurchase most of the property from her. Potter's stewardship of these farms earned her full regard, but she was not without her critics, not the least of which were her contemporaries, who felt she used her wealth and the position of her husband to acquire properties in advance of their being made public. She was notable in observing the problems of afforestation, preserving the intact grazing lands, and husbanding the quarries and timber of these farms. All her farms were stocked with Herdwick sheep and frequently with Galloway cattle. Beatrix continued to write stories and to draw, although mostly for her own pleasure. Her books in the late 1920s included the semi-autobiographical The Fairy Cavern, a fanciful tale set in her beloved Troutbeck Fells. It was published only in the US during Potter's lifetime, and not until 1952 in the UK. Sister Anne, Potter's version of the story of Bluebeard, was written for her American readers, but illustrated by Catherine Sturges. A final folk tale, Wag by Wall, was published by the Horn Book magazine in 1944. Potter was a generous patron of the Girl Guides, whose troop she allowed to make their summer encampments on her land, and whose company she enjoyed as an older woman. Beatrix and William Heelis enjoyed a happy marriage of 30 years, continuing their farming and preservation efforts throughout the hard days of World War II. Although they were childless, Beatrix played an important role in William's large family, particularly enjoying her relationship with several nieces whom she helped educate and giving comfort and aid to her husband's brother and sisters. Beatrix died of complications from pneumonia and heart disease on the 22nd of December 1943 at Castle Cottage, and her remains were cremated at Carlton Crematorium. She left nearly all her property to the National Trust, including over 4,000 acres of land, 16 farms, cottages, and herds of cattle and Herdwick sheep. Hers was the largest gift at the time to the National Trust, and it enabled the preservation of the land now included in the Lake District National Park and the continuation of fell farming. The central office of the National Trust in Swindon was named Heelis in 2005 in her memory. William Heelis continued his stewardship of their properties and of her literary and artistic work for 20 months that he survived her. When he died in August 1945, he left the remainder to the National Trust. Thank you for taking the time to watch my video. To support, please subscribe to Her Remarkable History. Thank you.